Hey, dear restless mind, you probably think being royalty in history meant living your best life. Golden palaces, silk sheets, unlimited power. The kind of existence streaming shows sell you with slow-motion shots of glittering crowns and endless feasts. But tomorrow, if you woke up as a woman in the Ottoman Sultan's harem, you wouldn't be living in paradise. You'd have a 99% chance of never reaching your 30th birthday. Because behind those glittering palace walls, 400 women lived in what looked like luxury but was really a silk-wrapped prison. A prison where your monthly period could condemn you to strangulation. A prison where getting pregnant without official permission meant being sewn alive into leather and tossed into the Bosphorus with cats scratching inside the sack. And yes, a prison where 12 eunuchs, not lovers, but bureaucrats with clipboards in their eyes, would gather after every intimate encounter to decide whether you were still worthy of your womb. Welcome to the part of history your textbooks skipped. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire's most horrifying invention, the Imperial Harem of Topkapi Palace. Forget the belly dancers you've seen in movies or the trays of Turkish delight placed delicately on silk. This wasn't romance. This was industrial-scale femicide dressed up with perfumes and jewels. And the strangest twist? For 500 years, the empire perfected this system so efficiently that even hardened European ambassadors, men who happily lit pyres under women accused of witchcraft, left Istanbul horrified by what they saw. But here's what most people don't realise. This wasn't random cruelty. It wasn't just moody sultans snapping their fingers. It was carefully designed, with rules, regulations and paperwork that would make your office's HR department look like chaos. Every death had a ledger. Every punishment followed protocol. Every broken woman was calculated. The Ottoman court would rather you remember the marble domes, the glittering tiles, the endless victories of armies sweeping across Europe. They don't want you to picture the silver tray that sealed women's fates, or the basement rooms where teenage girls lost their innocence, or the dark waters of the Bosphorus that became an unmarked graveyard. But tonight, we aren't skipping past those parts. Tonight, we step inside. Hey, dear timeless sleep community. Before we go further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together, here on Timeless Sleep. Every evening as the sun slid behind the skyline of Istanbul, the palace transformed into something stranger than a casino. Not a place where you gambled for coins, but a place where women gambled with their lives. Picture it. 400 concubines, ages 13 to 25, arranged in rows inside the Golden Hall. Their silks shimmered under oil lamps, their coal-lined eyes fixed on the floor, their hands trembling just enough to betray their fear. They were waiting for the silver tray. That tray began in the Sultan's private chambers. On it were slips of parchment, each marked with a woman's name. You might think the Sultan himself would choose. Wrong. That would be responsibility. Instead, eunuchs performed the ritual, turning the whole process into a grotesque lottery. Winning meant selection, and selection could mean a future of jewels or a sudden death. Imagine your name pulled from a hat at school, except instead of candy, you got dragged into a room where your body became the state's property. Congratulations, your prize is terror, and the cruelest rule, you had to look grateful. Smile even when your knees wanted to buckle. Bow even when your heart thundered. If you flinched, if you cried, if you hesitated for even a second, your act of reluctance was seen as treason against the Sultan himself. Records from 1640 tell of a girl named A, just 17, taken from Circassia and serving 3 years already inside the harem. On November 15th, her name was drawn. The eunuchs approached only to discover she was menstruating. The official record later listed her death as sudden illness. The truth, she never lived to see morning. In Topkapi Palace, biology itself was a noose, and if you passed that hurdle, you didn't go straight to the Sultan, you went to the preparation chamber. 12 eunuchs formed a circle, not with affection, but with clinical detachment. They checked teeth, hair, skin. They weighed you, recorded you, studied you like livestock. Then came the question, should the seed be preserved? Translation: should she keep her womb, or should she be sterilized, discarded, or destroyed? If the answer was yes, you were perfumed, oiled, dressed in gauzy silks, and led through torch-lit corridors to the Sultan's chambers. If no, you were marked for disposal. Sometimes that meant quiet surgery. Often it meant worse. And the numbers paint the horror. Out of 400 women inside the harem at any time, only 10 bore children. 10. The rest drifted in limbo, praying for invisibility. For many, being forgotten was the best possible fate. But being chosen multiple times without producing an heir was dangerous. On March 3, 1652, palace records note 23 women relocated in a single night. That word sounds harmless, like moving apartments. The reality? Witnesses whispered of a black-painted boat slipping across moonless waters, leather sacks stitched shut with struggling bodies inside tossed into the Bosphorus. Fishermen avoided those waters for generations, calling them mermaid graveyards. And here's the part most textbooks omit. The randomness wasn't random. Historians like Dr. Fatima Göçek uncovered documents proving the system was carefully engineered. Too much despair and the women might revolt, too much comfort and they might grow bold. So the palace calibrated the balance like a scientist twisting dials. Hope was rationed, despair metered, enough to keep the women competing, never uniting. The cruelty went deeper than punishments. It was psychological warfare. Instead of turning on their captors, women turned on each other. They spied on rivals, reported menstrual cycles, sabotaged each other's gowns. French ambassador Jean-Baptiste Tavernier wrote in 1675 that many concubines drank potions to destroy their own fertility, preferring barrenness to the lottery of death. Imagine drinking poison just to escape attention. And behind all this was money. Each concubine cost the empire what would be millions today, purchased from raiders or markets, fed, trained, clothed, jewelled. They weren't people in the eyes of the empire. They were investments. Investments that could be liquidated overnight. Religion was bent to justify it. Natural functions like menstruation declared impurity. Unauthorized pregnancies labelled theft. Theft from the Sultan himself, as though women's bodies were items in his treasury. Modern analysis of records shows the selections weren't truly random. Girls aged 16 to 18 were chosen more often. Women from Circassia, Ukraine and Georgia were especially prized. Intelligence, education, these were red flags. Clever women were overlooked on purpose. The Sultan wanted bodies, not minds. Makes modern dating apps look like paradise, doesn't it? We complain about being ghosted. These women became literal ghosts. Your worst Tinder date still beats their best night in Topkapi, and yet, inside this nightmare, one girl refused to be erased. A 15-year-old from Ukraine, captured by raiders, dragged in chains, sold in Istanbul. Her name was Alexandra Lisovska. History remembers her as Roxolana, or Hurrem Sultan. She survived the silver tray, she survived the rivalry, she survived the Sultan's whims, and she did more than survive, she conquered. Her story is where the nightmare takes an even darker turn, because to live in hell, sometimes you must become the fire yourself. The story of Roxolana doesn't begin in silk-draped halls or perfumed baths. It begins in a Ukrainian village, quiet and ordinary, where a 15-year-old girl picked wildflowers for Sunday service. Her father was an Orthodox priest, her family poor but content. Then one day, the ground shook with hooves. Crimean Tatar raiders swept across the fields, their swords flashing in the sunlight, their shouts scattering families like frightened birds. Within hours, her home was ash, her family dead, her wrists in chains. She was forced to march with dozens of other captives toward the Black Sea, toward markets that would decide their worth in coin. For the villagers left behind, her name was Alexandra. For the men who bought and sold her, she would become simply merchandise. Pale skin, red hair, bright eyes, traits considered exotic treasures in Istanbul. The slave markets were loud, bustling, and brutally casual. Buyers examined captives like fruit at a stall, testing teeth, pinching arms, weighing value. For most captives, fear hollowed their eyes. But Alexandra studied. She already understood the rules of this new world. Tears meant weakness, and weakness meant death. So she did not cry. When she arrived at Topkapi Palace, she was renamed Roxolana, the Russian, though she was not Russian at all. Names didn't matter here. The palace erased them as easily as chalk from a board. The real test lay ahead, the Asimi, the novice quarters where new concubines were trained. This wasn't a school of luxury, it was a drill ground for obedience and survival. In the novice halls, girls learned Turkish and Arabic prayers, practiced bowing until their backs ached, memorized songs and dances, and were beaten for errors. They were taught to walk silently, to smile on command, to pour wine without trembling. Every movement mattered. A single misstep could end with exile to the old palace, the Eskisaray, a living grave for concubines deemed unworthy. Roxolana learned quickly. She repeated Turkish phrases until her mouth bled, practicing accents until she could mimic native speakers. She learned Persian poetry, Ottoman etiquette, courtly dance. But she did more than learn, she observed. She watched how eunuchs walked, how senior concubines whispered, how favourites were treated differently. She turned her mind into a weapon sharper than any jewelled dagger. She also learned what happened to those who failed. One night she heard the muffled sobs of a girl who had spoken out of turn to a eunuch. By morning the girl's bed was empty. Another time a concubine stumbled during a dance lesson, and later that evening she was gone. The halls whispered of sudden illnesses, but everyone knew what those words meant. Each disappearance carved a lesson into Roxolana's heart. Adapt, survive, endure. When the silver tray appeared, Roxolana's name was eventually drawn. She was scrubbed in rosewater, painted with kohl, draped in silks. Her heart pounded as she was led to the preparation chamber, 12 eunuchs surrounding her. They inspected her like physicians, asking the same chilling question they asked every chosen woman. Should the seed be preserved? Their verdict was yes. She was sent onward, perfumed and trembling toward the Sultan's chambers. Suleiman the Magnificent was not yet old, not yet weary. He was a ruler of vast ambition, commanding armies across 3 continents. Yet in the privacy of his chambers, he was a man searching for novelty, for companionship, for something to capture his restless mind. Roxolana saw this instantly. Unlike others who bowed their heads in silent fear, she lifted her eyes. She did not speak recklessly, but when he spoke to her, she answered with wit. When he mentioned poetry, she recited lines she had memorized. When he asked about her homeland, she described the wheat fields of Ukraine, painting pictures so vivid that even a sultan paused to listen. It was a dangerous gamble. Most concubines who spoke too freely paid with their lives, but Roxolana knew she had to be different. If she was to survive, she couldn't just please the sultan. She had to hold his attention. Within months, she became one of his favourites. Within years, she became indispensable. She used tactics we now recognise as psychological manipulation, alternating warmth with distance, kindness with coldness, making him crave her approval. Historians call it intermittent reinforcement. Roxolana didn't just mirror Suleiman's interests, she became his intellectual partner. He liked poetry. She became a poet. He loved political debate. She studied until she could converse fluently. He enjoyed strategy. She asked questions that made him believe she understood the empire's heart as well as he did. But every rise drew enemies. Mahidevran, Suleiman's earlier favourite and the mother of Prince Mustafa, despised her. Once, in a jealous rage, Mahidevran attacked Roxolana, scratching her face and tearing her hair. The assault should have ended Roxolana's career. Instead, it elevated her. Suleiman sided with her, sending Mahidevran and her son away. It was the first sign that Roxolana's influence was more powerful than anyone had guessed. Roxolana's rise wasn't only about charm. She also mastered survival in the harem's brutal politics. She built alliances with eunuchs, bribing them with favours and jewels. She befriended servants, gathered whispers, and kept secrets others overlooked. Soon she had an intelligence network rivaling the viziers. She knew who plotted against her, who envied her, who wanted her gone, and she struck first, quietly, invisibly, ensuring rivals vanished before they could strike her. Her boldest move came in 1534. For centuries, Ottoman sultans never married their concubines. It avoided political complications, kept heirs in competition, and maintained the sultan's freedom. But Roxolana convinced Suleiman to marry her, an act that broke 500 years of tradition. How did she do it? Through carefully written letters, each a masterpiece of manipulation. In them she painted their love as destiny, a bond too sacred to remain unofficial. Suleiman, intoxicated by her words, agreed. The empire reeled in shock. Marriage gave Roxolana unprecedented power. She bore Suleiman 6 children, securing her position. But power brought peril. Prince Mustafa, Mahidevran's son, remained a threat as heir apparent. He was competent, popular, admired by soldiers. In another life, he might have been a great sultan. For Roxolana, he was an obstacle her children could not survive. She began a campaign of whispers, letters forged, rumours spread, doubts planted. She convinced Suleiman that Mustafa plotted rebellion. It took years, but her persistence wore him down. In 1553, Suleiman ordered Mustafa strangled. Witnesses said Roxolana watched from behind a screen, expressionless, as the empire's most promising prince was killed by the cords of the Bostancer. She had destroyed her rival without lifting a hand. From there, her grip tightened. She corresponded with foreign rulers, commissioned mosques and charities, acted as political advisor. She became not just a wife, not just a concubine, but a force in Ottoman politics. Yet behind her achievements lay a trail of corpses, rivals silenced, enemies erased, princes dead. She had become exactly what the system demanded, a survivor forged into a weapon. And yet, can we blame her? In a world where 400 women lived at the mercy of a silver tray, where beauty faded quickly and obscurity meant death, perhaps monstrosity was the only path to survival. The irony is that Roxolana, once a captive, became the only woman in Ottoman history buried beside a sultan. From priest-daughter to slave, from concubine to queen, she had beaten the system, not by escaping it, but by becoming its master. But her story was only one thread in a much larger tapestry. For every Roxolana who rose, hundreds of others sank, drowned, exiled or erased. Their lives were measured not in years but in chances, their worth not in character but in wombs. And behind it all loomed the Sultan himself, whose whims could shatter lives in a heartbeat. Roxolana's rise was more than a personal triumph. It was proof that the harem itself was a battlefield. Behind the jewelled doors and perfumed corridors, women weren't simply waiting to be chosen. They were calculating, manoeuvring, and sometimes clawing at each other with a ferocity that no soldier on a battlefield could rival. To be forgotten was to die slowly. To be chosen was to risk dying quickly. But to become a favourite, that was both the most dangerous and the most tempting path of all. The hierarchy inside the harem was deceptively simple. Novices at the bottom, favourites at the top. But those who reached the upper tiers found themselves under constant attack. A favourite might live in rooms filled with silks and cushions, her attendants ready to clothe her in jewels each morning, but she also lived under siege. Every woman who had not yet risen coveted her place, and every woman who had once held power but lost it simmered with resentment. Even her allies could turn enemy overnight. The harem wasn't a sisterhood, it was an empire of rivalry. Mahidevran's fall at the hands of Roxolana made this truth undeniable. She had once been secure, her son Mustafa a beloved heir, her position steady. But after a single violent encounter with Roxolana, she was outmaneuvered. She had let rage overcome strategy, and the moment she left scratches on Roxolana's face, she gave her rival the weapon she needed. When Suleiman learned what had happened, he did not punish Roxolana. He punished Mahidevran, sending her and Mustafa away. For the women who watched, the lesson was clear. In the harem, even violence had to be calculated. The wrong gesture at the wrong time could cost everything. This atmosphere of constant suspicion and ambition created bizarre scenes. Women who sang duets together in the morning might be whispering betrayals about each other by night. Friends were a luxury no one could afford. One Venetian envoy wrote with fascination, "They smile as sisters and plot as assassins." Behind every embrace, a knife waited. One of the strangest aspects of this power game was the role of gossip. Rumours were more lethal than daggers. A concubine could ruin a rival by suggesting she had looked too long at a guard, or by hinting that she was barren, or by whispering that she had spoken against the Sultan. Even if untrue, the mere suggestion could condemn her. No one asked for evidence, suspicion was enough. In the silence of the harem, whispers became weapons. The stakes were not just personal, because a favourite who bore a son wasn't merely raising a child, she was raising a potential sultan. That meant she could someday wield the power of a queen mother, the Valide Sultan, whose authority stretched over the palace and even into the politics of the empire. Every pregnancy was a gamble with the future. To the eunuchs and administrators, the harem was not a place of entertainment, but a factory producing heirs. To the women inside, it was a place where motherhood meant both safety and danger. Bear a son, and you gained leverage. Fail, and you risked disposal. This transformed the harem into a place where even the smallest details mattered. A cough, a missed period, a hushed conversation, all could spark suspicion. It was as if the walls themselves had ears recording every breath. Women learned to guard not just their words but their expressions. To frown was to risk punishment. To smile too broadly was to risk mockery. The safest mask was composure, but even that could be interpreted as arrogance. And then there were the poisons. The Ottomans had mastered the art of discreet assassination, and nowhere was it more refined than in the harem. Drinks could be laced with powders that killed slowly, allowing a woman to waste away while officials wrote illness in the record books. Perfumes might be adulterated with toxins, jewellery dusted with substances that poisoned through the skin. Forensic science didn't exist, so rumours filled the gaps. Servants whispered of women who collapsed after drinking sherbet, or who sickened after wearing new earrings. Whether true or not, fear of poison lingered, in every chamber. This atmosphere of paranoia was part of the system's design. By keeping the women focused on destroying one another, the empire ensured they never united against the men who ruled them. It was divide and conquer played out in silk robes and whispered conspiracies. Even when a favourite rose high, she knew the same machinery that elevated her could crush her tomorrow. One of the clearest examples came after Roxolana's marriage to Suleiman. Suddenly she was no longer just a concubine, but a legal wife, something unheard of in centuries of Ottoman tradition. To many women in the harem this seemed impossible, even insulting. Some responded with quiet despair, others with renewed plotting. But none could deny the new order. Roxolana had changed the rules of the game. If she could break tradition, then perhaps others could too. The harem buzzed with envy and fear, but Roxolana was not blind. She knew her new status painted a target on her back. She tightened her network of spies, bribed eunuchs, and manipulated the Sultan with carefully chosen words. She became not just a player in the game, but its master. Other women tried to outmaneuver her, but she was always 2 steps ahead. Some whispered that she dabbled in witchcraft, others that she read omens, but the truth was simpler. She was ruthlessly intelligent, and in a world designed to break women, she refused to bend. For the average concubine, though, there was no such power. Most lived in quiet desperation, hoping never to be noticed, surviving day by day. They watched as favourites rose and fell, as rivalries turned deadly, as whispers poisoned friendships. They dressed in jewels they knew might outlast them, sang songs in chambers that might become their tombs. They prayed for obscurity, the only shield against ambition's knife. The palace officials, of course, kept records. Ledgers detailed who was favoured, who was exiled, who vanished. But behind those cold words lay stories of laughter and fear, of women who dreamed of freedom and woke to chains. To the scribes, they were statistics. To each other, they were both companions and enemies. To us, centuries later, they are shadows flickering in candlelight, their voices almost lost. Yet their struggles mattered. The harem was not just a private prison, it was a crucible shaping the Ottoman Empire itself. The sons born in those chambers grew into sultans, their reigns marked by the rivalries and manipulations their mothers had survived. The empire's fate often hinged on which favourite outmanoeuvred another, which concubine bore the heir, which rumour condemned a rival. The games of the harem echoed in battlefields and treaties across Europe and Asia. For the women, though, those echoes mattered little. Each night was another gamble, each glance another risk, each breath another reminder that beauty and ambition could not shield them from death's silken cord. Favourites rose and favourites fell, and through it all the palace continued to hum with music, incense, and the soft sound of women laughing nervously at jokes they dared not ignore. In this world, power was a mirage, dazzling, intoxicating, and deadly. To reach for it was to risk burning alive, but to refuse it was to accept slow extinction. And so the harem spun on, its women trapped in a perpetual contest, each one fighting for survival in the only ways available: poison, rumour, alliance, or submission. And at the centre of it all sat the Sultan, whose whims could crown or kill, whose gaze could transform a girl into a queen, or erase her from memory. He was the storm around which the harem revolved, and his unpredictable nature made every rivalry twice as dangerous. For the women of the harem, love was never safe, trust was never possible, and survival was never guaranteed. By now you've seen how rivalry and whispers sharpened the air inside the harem, but behind all of it stood the most terrifying force of all, the Sultan himself. If the harem was a maze of silk-draped traps, then the Sultan was the hand that could tilt the entire labyrinth on a whim. His power was absolute, unchecked, and frighteningly unpredictable. For the women who lived under his gaze, every heartbeat became a calculation, every smile a performance, every step a gamble. Because while bureaucrats might shuffle papers and eunuchs might enforce rules, the Sultan's mood alone could elevate or annihilate. Think of it this way. Imagine living in a world where your existence hinged on whether a single man liked the way you poured his sherbet. If the drink was too cold, you might lose a night's sleep in fear. If you laughed too loudly at the wrong moment, you might never see the sunrise. This wasn't exaggeration. Ottoman history is filled with chilling stories of sultans whose moods cost women their lives. Take Ibrahim I, often remembered with the mocking title Ibrahim the Mad. His reign was infamous for its extremes. In one moment he lavished jewels on his favourites, commissioning gowns embroidered with pearls and palaces in their names. In the next he ordered mass executions. Chronicles describe a single night when he had hundreds of women drowned in the Bosphorus, their bodies weighted in sacks, tossed into the black current. Whether the number was exaggerated or not, the truth remained. The Sultan's suspicions alone could wipe out an entire wing of the harem. Selim II, Suleiman's son, was another example. Nicknamed the Sot for his love of wine, Selim was less violent but no less dangerous. His drunkenness made him erratic, and erratic meant lethal. He once banished a favourite concubine simply because she laughed when he tripped over a cushion. Her laughter, meant as affection, was taken as mockery. She disappeared by morning. In Topkapi Palace, even joy was risky. The silken cord was the Sultan's favourite weapon. Unlike Europe's gruesome public executions, hangings in squares, burnings at stakes, the Ottomans preferred quiet efficiency. Blood was considered unclean for members of the royal household, so the Bostons, palace gardeners turned executioners, were trained in strangulation. They used cords of silk, twisted 7 times for strength, drawn tight around the neck until life slipped silently away. 2 men performed the act. One held the victim's shoulders, the other pulled the cord. The entire process was designed to leave no stain, no sound, no evidence. It was murder turned into protocol. The worst part? Women often knew in advance. Many were informed of their fate at sunset, given a final meal, and left to wait until dawn. Imagine that night, pacing marble floors, writing desperate letters that would never be sent, whispering prayers to gods who seemed deaf to the palace walls. Every tick of the clock closer to morning was another hammerbeat of terror. By the time footsteps echoed outside, most women were already broken. But execution wasn't the only punishment. Sometimes the Sultan preferred exile, which could be crueler. The old palace, the Eski Saray, was a living graveyard. Women sent there weren't killed, they were forgotten. They lived out their days in dusty chambers with faded rugs, stripped of jewels and silks, their names erased from memory. For many it was worse than death, to be alive, but invisible, existing as shadows of what they once were. One traveller described the old palace as a tomb where the dead still walk. Other punishments were absurd, grotesque in their creativity. Ibrahim III once ordered women who displeased him to stand for hours in icy fountains. Another sultan commanded favourites to be locked in chambers without food until they begged forgiveness, then showered them with gifts days later, laughing at their desperation. These weren't punishments rooted in law. They were whims, caprices, games played with human lives. Pregnancy was no shield. A concubine who bore the sultan a son gained status but also risk. The child might one day become heir, and that made both mother and child dangerous in the Sultan's paranoid eyes. More than one prince was strangled at the order of his own father, his mother forced to watch in silence. Mothers who begged for mercy often followed their sons into death. The harem's lullabies were haunted by this terror, songs of love sung in whispers, always shadowed by the fear of silence. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed fragments of these horrors sent letters home that mixed shock with fascination. One French envoy wrote, "In this place, laughter is dangerous, beauty is dangerous, even silence is dangerous. They live as though their souls hang from threads of silk." To outsiders, it seemed unbelievable that a system so cruel could last. To the women inside, it was simply the rhythm of life. Constant fear, brief moments of grace, and always the knowledge that the Sultan's gaze could erase them, at will. And the Sultans knew the power they wielded. They cultivated it. By executing a concubine here, banishing another there, they kept the entire harem trembling. They didn't need to kill constantly. The possibility alone was enough. A single drowning echoed through the palace for months. One exile to the old palace silenced a dozen rivals. Terror did the work more efficiently than any sword. For you, standing inside that palace, the atmosphere would feel suffocating. Imagine walking down a corridor lit by oil lamps, the smell of incense heavy in the air. Behind you, you hear the faint shuffle of eunuchs. Ahead, the shadows stretch long across marble floors. At every corner your heart lurches, wondering if tonight is the night your name will be whispered, your chamber door opened, your life quietly ended. Even in moments of apparent peace, music drifting from distant rooms, laughter from other women, dread remained the constant undertone. The Sultan's whims extended beyond punishment. Sometimes he rewarded favourites with extravagant gifts, estates, jewels, whole caravans of silks. A woman could wake one morning to find herself wealthy beyond imagination, a small empire in her hands. But the gifts were traps. Wealth made her visible, visibility made her envied, envy made her vulnerable. For every jewel placed in her hands, a rival sharpened her whispers. This unpredictability was the essence of life in the harem. A sultan could transform a concubine into a queen, then erase her as though she never existed. He could raise her sons as heirs, then order their deaths. He could shower her with affection in the evening, then hand her to the bastoncer by dawn. Every day was a coin toss, and the women lived their lives staring at the spinning silver, praying it landed on mercy. And yet, amid all this, they adapted. They learned to read the Sultan's moods the way sailors read skies. A sigh meant storm, a laugh meant false calm, silence meant death. They trained themselves to anticipate his whims, to please before he grew displeased, to vanish before he grew bored. But even the most skilled could only survive for so long. In the end, no calculation could predict madness. That was the truth of the Sultan's power. It was not just absolute, it was arbitrary. And arbitrariness was the most terrifying cruelty of all. Because how do you prepare for a fate that can turn on a whim? How do you survive in a palace where a stumble, a word, a smile could kill you? You don't. You endure. You pray to be invisible. You whisper to yourself that tomorrow might bring mercy. And you remember always that in the harem of the Ottoman Sultan, beauty was a sentence, power was a trap, and survival was never guaranteed. If the Sultan's brutal whims ruled the lives of concubines, they cast an even darker shadow over the sons born inside those walls. Because being a prince in the Ottoman dynasty was never a guarantee of glory. It was often a sentence. The empire had perfected a system so cruel, so paradoxical, that it raised heirs like hothouse flowers while preparing to strangle them at the first sign of bloom. They called it the golden cage. To outsiders, it looked like protection. To those who lived within it, it was a velvet coffin. The logic behind it was simple, in the most chilling way. Ottoman succession had no clear rule of primogeniture, no straightforward line of inheritance. Instead, any son of the Sultan could be considered a potential heir. In theory, that meant talent could triumph, the strongest prince rising above the rest. In practice, it meant brothers became enemies before they could even grow beards. Civil wars tore the empire apart more than once, as rival sons marched armies against one another, each claiming the throne as his destiny. The empire's solution was grim efficiency. If one son became sultan, the others must die. It was called fratricide, and it was not metaphorical. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers were strangled with silken cords, their bodies buried quickly and quietly. No blood could be spilled, no marks left on royal skin. Mercy meant speed, not survival. For the mothers who had borne these boys, it meant watching their children play in marble courtyards, knowing that only one at most might live past manhood. The practice shocked European observers, but within the empire it was accepted as necessary. A dead prince was a tragedy, a civil war was worse. So the system continued for centuries, generation after generation, until the very concept of brotherhood inside the palace became synonymous with suspicion and fear. Imagine growing up in a nursery where every lullaby carried the unspoken refrain, "One day your brother may kill you," or worse, "Your father may order it." For the concubines, motherhood became both their highest aspiration and their greatest curse. To bear a son was to secure status, wealth, influence. But it also meant living with the knowledge that your child might be strangled by his uncle, his cousin, or even by the order of his own father. Mothers in the harem whispered blessings over their children, but they also whispered warnings. Love was fierce, but it was always edged with terror. Consider the fate of Prince Mustafa, the son of Mahidevran. By all accounts, he was brilliant, strong, capable, admired by soldiers, loved by the people. He was the kind of heir who might have strengthened the empire. But Roxolana saw him as a threat to her own sons. She spun a web of rumours, suggesting Mustafa plotted rebellion, whispering poison into Suleiman's ear until the Sultan believed his beloved son sought his crown. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. The prince entered proudly, unaware. Behind the curtains waited the Bostonser. Within moments, Mustafa was dead. His life ended not by battle, but by silken cords. Soldiers outside wept openly, but none could resist. The order had come from the Sultan himself. This was the golden cage at its most cruel. Not just the confinement of princes, but the certainty that brilliance was more dangerous than incompetence. To shine too brightly was to invite suspicion, to die for the crime of being admired. The safest princes were those who stayed quiet, unremarkable, forgotten. Imagine being a child and learning that the best way to live was to dim your own light. As the centuries wore on, the system evolved into literal imprisonment. Princes not immediately executed were confined in the cafes, the cage, secluded apartments within Topkapi Palace. There, they lived in gilded isolation, forbidden to leave, their only companions eunuchs and tutors. They had food, clothing and safety, but no freedom. Some spent decades in the cage, growing into middle-aged men who had never walked beyond palace walls, never ridden a horse, never commanded troops, and then, suddenly, one of them might be called forth to rule an empire. The results were predictably tragic. Sultans raised in the cage often emerged paranoid, unstable, unprepared for leadership. Some turned to indulgence, drowning themselves in drink and concubines. Others sank into madness, their paranoia twisting into cruelty. Ibrahim I, the same sultan who once drowned his harem, had spent much of his youth locked in the cage. By the time he wore the crown, the damage was done. For the women of the harem, the golden cage was another battlefield. A mother's ambition for her son could collide with another's, sparking rivalries that ended in poison, exile, or death. The harem wasn't simply about pleasing the sultan, it was about shaping the future through sons who might rule or die. Every lullaby was sung with a sword hanging overhead. Every smile a boy gave his mother carried the weight of uncertain destiny. European envoys recorded their astonishment at this system. In their eyes, the Ottomans were destroying their best talent, sacrificing capable princes in favour of fearful survivors. They kill their lions and raise their mice, one Venetian complained. But the Ottomans saw it differently. Better to kill lions early than let them fight each other until the empire itself bled out. Cold, efficient, brutal, but undeniably effective in maintaining control. Inside the palace, though, effectiveness meant nothing to the women who lost their children. Imagine being a concubine who bore a son, watching him grow into a strong young man, hearing whispers of his promise, and then one day watching eunuchs drag him away. Imagine clawing at the marble floors, begging for mercy, knowing your voice carried no weight, Some mothers collapsed into grief, others hardened, learning to wield ambition like a weapon, determined to outmaneuver every rival. The Valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, often stood at the centre of these struggles, protecting her own children at any cost. She might smile at another mother in the morning and plot her son's downfall by night. The cage created men who were both survivors and victims. One prince might emerge from decades of confinement cautious and cunning, ruling with careful hands. Another might emerge broken, paranoid, lashing out in cruelty. The empire lived with the consequences. Wars were won or lost, policies shaped or ruined, all because of a system designed to prevent chaos by creating it on a smaller, quieter scale inside palace walls. For the concubines, the golden cage was proof that their children's futures were never their own. They could fight, plot, bribe, and prey. But in the end, the decision rested with the Sultan and the cords of the Bostancer. Some women chose to gamble everything, pushing their sons forward, manipulating politics to secure their path. Others chose invisibility, hoping their sons might survive by staying unnoticed. Both paths were fraught, and both ended too often in tragedy. So the palace sang its lullabies, its marble halls echoed with children's laughter, and all the while the cage waited. It gleamed with gilded bars, polished floors, and velvet cushions, but it was still a cage. Princes peered out at the world through latticed windows, dreaming of power they might never touch, fearing death they could not avoid. The empire called it necessary, the mothers called it torment, the princes called it life, until one day they no longer could. If the Sultan's whims could shape destinies and the golden cage could strangle princes before their time, then the figure who stood like a shadow over all of it was the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. In the hierarchy of the Ottoman court, she was untouchable, the most powerful woman in the empire, the spider at the very centre of the silk-spun web. For concubines, she was both guardian and executioner, the one who could raise them from obscurity or bury them in silence. And for the Sultan himself, she was the only person who could speak with a voice he dared not ignore. The Valid Sultan was more than a mother. She was the overseer of the harem, the manager of its finances, the director of its politics. Eunuchs reported to her, concubines feared her, viziers respected her. In a world where women's lives were usually measured by the men who ruled them, she stood apart as a force-wielding authority on her own terms. The harem might have been imagined as a cage of powerless women, but in truth, its top tier, embodied by the Valid Sultan, rivaled the authority of viziers and generals. Her apartments within Topkapi were a palace within a palace. Lavish chambers overlooked courtyards where eunuchs scurried and novices bowed. She controlled enormous wealth, commanding stipends that surpassed most ministers. With her funds, she built mosques, sponsored charities, and extended her influence far beyond the harem walls. To be Valid Sultan was not merely to survive, it was to reign. But the road to that pinnacle was paved with broken rivals. To become Valid, a woman had to maneuver her son onto the throne. That meant protecting him from rivals, whispering against other princes, aligning with powerful viziers, and ensuring her boy survived both the silver tray of selections and the golden cage of succession. When her son finally emerged as Sultan, she ascended beside him, rewarded not only with safety, but with unmatched influence. Consider Hafsa Sultan, the mother of Suleiman the Magnificent. When Suleiman rose to power, Hafsa became Valid Sultan, and with that title, she became the most formidable woman in Istanbul. She mediated between viziers, sponsored public works, and even commanded armies indirectly through her son's decisions. Foreign ambassadors understood her power so clearly that they sometimes addressed their petitions not to Suleiman but to Hafsa, knowing her word could sway imperial policy. For concubines within the harem, Hafsa was judge, jury, and executioner. A glance from her could raise a woman to luxury. A frown could consign her to exile in the old palace. And yet, Hafsa's authority was only the beginning. Her successors carried the role to even greater extremes. Kösem Sultan, perhaps the most famous of all Valid sultans, ruled during what historians call the Sultanate of Women. She was regent for her young sons Murad IV and Ibrahim I, and later wielded power as grandmother to Mehmed IV. For decades she controlled the empire from behind veils and curtains, her orders whispered but no less binding than imperial decrees. She brokered alliances, directed executions, and reshaped the empire's politics. To her rivals, she was a demon. To her allies, a saviour. To everyone else, she was untouchable. Life under the Valide Sultan was a paradox. For the concubines, she could be protector and tormentor in equal measure. On one hand, she ensured order, preventing chaos within the harem. On the other, she used her authority to eliminate rivals with surgical precision. When a concubine grew too ambitious, it was often the Valide who whispered to the Sultan that the girl should be removed. When a prince seemed too threatening, it was often his grandmother's quiet word that sealed his fate. The Valide Sultan also shaped the psychology of the harem. Women learned quickly that pleasing the Sultan was not enough. One had to please his mother as well. Flattery directed at the Sultan might win a smile, but deference to the Valide could mean survival. She was the keeper of keys, the guardian of fortunes, the silent hand that turned the wheel of the harem's endless cycle. But her power came at a cost. To remain secure, the Valide had to be ruthless. Even her own grandchildren could not be spared if they threatened the stability of her son's reign. Kösem Sultan herself was accused of orchestrating the deaths of princes who stood in the way of her chosen heirs. Whether all the accusations were true or not, the legend was powerful enough. In the Ottoman imagination, the Valide's love for her children could transform into a weapon sharper than any executioner's cord. For the concubines below her, the Valide was both a figure of awe and of terror. Imagine being a young novice, bowing low as she passed, knowing that this woman had survived everything you were only beginning to fear. Her jewels glittered not just with wealth, but with blood. Every ruby a rival erased, every pearl a whisper of ambition silenced. And yet she could also be merciful. Some Valides took pity on concubines, granting them stipends, easing their burdens, even protecting them from the Sultan's darker whims. Survival under her watch depended on reading her as carefully as one read the Sultan. Every word, every smile, every silence mattered. European visitors were astonished by the Valide's influence. They had imagined the Ottoman harem as a place of powerless women. Instead, they found an empire within an empire ruled by a woman whose authority rivaled kings. Venetian ambassadors described audiences with the Valide as more intimidating than those with the Sultan himself. One called her the queen whose throne is hidden but whose power is seen everywhere. The paradox of the Valide was this: she represented the pinnacle of female power in a world designed to oppress women. She could command armies through her son, redirect fortunes and decide the fate of thousands. But she only gained that position by enduring the same horrors as the concubines she now ruled over. Every Valide had once been a terrified girl, scrubbed in rosewater, dressed in silks, and led trembling before the Sultan. To reach the summit, she had to outwit, outlast, and outmaneuver hundreds of others. Her power was not granted freely. It was purchased with decades of fear, calculation, and survival. And once she held that power, she wielded it without hesitation, because she knew better than anyone that hesitation meant death. The women of the harem understood this clearly. Their prayers were whispered as much to the Valide as to God. Their gifts, their flattery, their ambitions all bent toward her. She was the sun around which their small worlds revolved. And when she looked away, they shivered, because her gaze could be the only shield against the Sultan's storm. So the harem spun on, its silks shimmering, its jewels glittering, its perfumes masking the scent of fear. And at its heart sat the Valide Sultan, the mother, the ruler, the iron hand in velvet gloves. She was the final proof that in Topkapi Palace, power did not flow only through men with swords, but also through women who had learned to master the cruelest game of survival ever played. If the Valide Sultan embodied the highest heights a woman in the harem could reach, the punishments for disobedience showed the depths to which she could fall. To the outside world, the harem was wrapped in silk, its walls gleaming with tiles, its corridors perfumed with incense. But beneath that sheen lay a code of discipline as strict and merciless as any battlefield. A concubine's survival hinged not only on charm or beauty, but also on absolute obedience. The smallest mistake, a wrong word, a glance held too long, a step out of place, could unleash consequences that erased her existence. The Ottomans prided themselves on order. Everything in the palace had rules, from how a meal was served to how lamps were lit at dusk. Within the harem, rules governed every breath. Concubines rose at fixed hours, bathed according to schedules, recited prayers under supervision, and rehearsed songs and dances with military precision. To break routine, to resist, even to show reluctance was to challenge the system itself. And the system answered swiftly. Punishments began with humiliation. A concubine who disobeyed an order might be stripped of her silks and forced to scrub marble floors on her knees while her peers watched. She might be assigned to the lowest chores, carrying water, cleaning latrines, cooking for servants. These tasks weren't just punishments. They were symbols, reminders that even the most adorned favourite could be reduced to labour like a slave in a moment. But humiliation could escalate. Exile to the old palace, the Eski Sarai, was a punishment feared almost as much as death. The old palace was where disobedient concubines were sent to wither in obscurity. Once there, their jewels were taken, their silks replaced with plain garments, their attendants dismissed. The lively music and chatter of Topkapi faded into silence and dust. For many it was a psychological death, living years in exile, forgotten, their dreams dissolved into shadows. When the offence was considered serious, punishments grew harsher. The Bostonser, those same gardeners who doubled as executioners, enforced discipline with terrifying efficiency. Whipping was rare, because it left marks, and marks were undesirable on women considered royal property. Instead, other methods were preferred. Starvation, isolation, icy water baths, all were inflicted to break a woman's spirit without staining her skin. One particularly cruel punishment was confinement in dark cells beneath the palace. These chambers, small and windowless, left women in complete silence, sometimes for weeks. They emerged pale, trembling, their minds scarred by loneliness. A few never fully recovered, their sanity lost in the shadows. The harem whispered of these cells like children whisper of monsters under the bed, terrifying, half-believed, but real enough to silence defiance. And then, of course, there was death. Strangulation with silk cords was the most common form of execution. It was clean, fast, and discreet. A concubine condemned to death might be informed in the evening, given a final meal, and then taken to a private chamber where 2 Bostons awaited. Their work was efficient, honed by practice. The silk cord left no blood, no mess, only silence. To the outside world, the woman had died of illness. Inside the harem, everyone understood. Another feared punishment was the sack. Women who became pregnant without authorization, or who were accused of infidelity, whether true or false, faced the suvalama, the sack punishment. They were sewn into leather sacks, sometimes with cats or dogs, the animals included to ensure panic and thrashing as the sack sank. Then, under moonless skies, the sack was rowed into the Bosphorus and tossed overboard. The current swept it away, the sea swallowing secrets. Ottoman chronicles downplay this practice, but European ambassadors wrote of it often, horrified by its cruelty. Fishermen in later centuries spoke of mermaid graves, places in the strait they refused to fish because too many bodies had been dumped there. Punishment was not always physical. Psychological warfare was woven into daily life. A concubine might be deliberately ignored, left unchosen for months, forced to watch rivals rise. The silence was crushing, the waiting worse than pain. Others might be paraded in humiliation, stripped of jewels and forced to serve those who had once been equals. Some women turned to prayer, others to despair, still others to secret plotting. But all knew the system was designed to keep them broken, docile, and divided. Even the eunuchs, who seemed like mere guards, enforced punishments with ruthless consistency. The chief black eunuch, the Qizlar Asa, oversaw discipline with near absolute authority. His word could condemn or pardon. Concubines feared him as much as the valid sultan, for he held the keys to their chambers, their routines, their lives. A whisper to him could destroy a rival, but his frown alone could doom a woman. Every punishment carried a lesson. Resistance was useless, obedience the only path. Yet despite the system's cruelty, women resisted in small ways. Some whispered songs mocking eunuchs when alone. Others stole moments of friendship, braiding each other's hair, sharing secret jokes, even knowing betrayal might come tomorrow. Resistance lived in their laughter, in the quiet way they remembered their names before the palace renamed them. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was human. Still, the punishments loomed larger than any defiance. The harem was a machine, and its discipline was oil to keep it running. The threat of humiliation, exile, strangulation, or drowning ensured that hundreds of women remained under control. Fear was the constant companion in every chamber, the invisible chain heavier than any iron. Imagine yourself there. You sit in your chamber, oil lamps flickering, incense masking the faint smell of damp stone. You hear a commotion outside, footsteps, whispers, the shuffle of a cord being drawn tight, then silence. A door closes. Life continues as if nothing happened. You look around at your companions, their faces composed, their eyes empty. No one speaks, but in their silence lies the knowledge that one of them has just been erased, and you wonder if tomorrow it will be you. Punishments in the harem weren't random cruelty, they were strategy. Every humiliation reminded women of their fragility. Every exile silenced potential dissent. Every execution reinforced the message that obedience was life. The empire didn't need walls of iron. It needed only silk cords, leather sacks, and fear. And fear did the rest. The harem glittered on the outside, a paradise of tiles and gardens. Inside, it was a place where women lived with death as their constant companion, and yet life continued. Music played, perfumes burned, laughter echoed, because even in the shadow of punishment, the women endured, survived, and sometimes, against all odds, conquered. The punishments of the harem were terrifying, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. Behind every strangulation, every exile, every sudden illness scribbled into a ledger stood the shadowy figures who made the system function, the eunuchs. They were the ever-present watchers, the invisible hands that locked doors, carried trays, whispered secrets, and, when ordered, tightened cords. To understand the harem without understanding the eunuchs would be like describing a theatre without mentioning the stagehands. They were not merely servants, they were power brokers, manipulators, and sometimes puppeteers in their own right. The chief among them was the Kislar Asa, the chief black eunuch. Imported mostly from Africa as children, castrated before puberty, these men were raised within palace walls, stripped of family, of lineage, of normal futures. The empire took their bodies, but in return gave them access to corridors where even viziers tread carefully. The chief black eunuch wielded authority over hundreds of women, commanded vast resources, and sometimes influenced imperial politics to a degree that made grand viziers nervous. His quarters, situated near the harem, were not luxurious by comparison, but they were strategic. Every path into the harem passed by his watch, every concubine's schedule, every ritual of selection, every punishment was filtered through his authority. If the sultan was the storm, the Valid sultan the sun, then the chief eunuch was the gravity holding the entire orbit together. The eunuch's power was paradoxical. On the surface they were mutilated slaves, outsiders with no families or heirs. But this very condition made them trustworthy to the empire. They could not found dynasties of their own. They had no bloodline to defend. Their loyalty was expected to be absolute, to the sultan, to the Valid, to the system itself. But loyalty and power rarely walked together without intrigue following close behind. And the eunuchs became masters of intrigue. They knew the secrets of every chamber. They heard the whispers of concubines plotting against rivals. They carried letters between favourites and viziers. They oversaw the baths, the feasts, the punishments. No laugh, no tear, no sob escaped their notice. And because knowledge was power, they sold it carefully, sometimes in bribes, sometimes in favours, sometimes in whispered hints that could make or break a concubine's future. Concubines learned quickly that survival meant currying favour with eunuchs. A gift of gold, a smile at the right moment, a whispered promise. All could tilt the scales. Eunuchs could delay the silver tray, ensuring a rival's name wasn't chosen. They could falsify menstrual records, buying a woman another month of safety. They could even, in rare cases, misreport a woman's death as illness when in fact she had been murdered by rivals. The harem's bureaucracy depended on them, and bureaucracy always meant opportunities for corruption. The chief black eunuch also became a diplomat. Ambassadors from Europe often sought his ear, knowing he had the sultan's attention. His influence extended beyond the harem walls into the empire's politics. Viziers might resent him, but they could not ignore him. He was the invisible wall separating the outside world from the sultan's most private domain. Anyone who wanted access, to the harem, to the sultan, even to the Valid, went through him. This immense power made the position dangerous as well. More than one chief eunuch met a sudden end, accused of disloyalty or corruption, but while they lived, they thrived. They amassed fortunes, purchasing estates, commissioning mosques, leaving behind legacies in stone even though they could leave no heirs. Their names are still etched in Ottoman records, reminders that in a system designed to castrate them, they carved out influence that rivaled kings. The eunuchs beneath the chief were equally essential. Black eunuchs guarded the harem's inner doors, while white eunuchs, often from the Balkans, oversaw the sultan's pages and administrative duties. Rivalries between the two groups sometimes simmered, each claiming superiority, but in the harem, the black eunuchs reigned supreme. They were the eyes and ears of the Valid Sultan, the enforcers of order, the stranglers in silk. For the concubines, their presence was both suffocating and strangely intimate. Imagine living every moment of your life under the eyes of men who were neither fully men nor entirely powerless. They escorted you to baths, inspected your garments, timed your prayers. They were guardians, jailers, servants, and executioners all in one. A kind glance could mean a brief moment of comfort. A frown could seal your doom. Whispers about the eunuchs themselves filled the harem. Some concubines despised them as heartless enforcers. Others pitied them, seeing in their mutilation a cruelty that mirrored their own captivity. A few even trusted them, forging bonds that blurred the line between master and servant. But no one forgot that the eunuch's ultimate loyalty was to the system, not to individual women. In the end, they served the empire, not the heart. And yet, their intrigues often reshaped history. During the reign of Kösem Sultan, the chief black eunuch played a pivotal role in ensuring her regency. When rivals sought to undermine her, it was the eunuch's network of whispers that silenced dissent. Later, during the turbulent years of boy sultans, eunuchs became kingmakers, guiding fragile rulers with advice and intimidation. They might not sit on thrones, but their shadows stretched across them. For the concubines trapped within the harem, the eunuchs were inescapable. You might fear the sultan, respect the valid, despise your rivals, but it was the eunuchs who stood outside your door each night, holding the keys to your chamber, your schedule, your fate. Their intrigue was a constant hum, a background noise as steady as your own heartbeat. You never forgot they were there because forgetting meant underestimating, and underestimating meant death. Picture the scene. A concubine waits nervously in her chamber, her name perhaps drawn for the night. Outside, the shuffle of eunuchs' sandals echoes in the hall. They approach slowly, deliberately, savouring her dread. When they stop, she knows her time has come. If they pass her door, she breathes again. If they enter, her life changes forever, for better, for worse, or for its end. That moment, repeated night after night, made eunuchs both the most hated and the most necessary figures in the harem. Their intrigue was not just survival, it was artistry. They balanced loyalty to the valid, obedience to the sultan, manipulation of concubines, and their own hunger for wealth and influence. They thrived in shadows, shaping destinies with a glance, a word, a delayed note. And though they left no children to carry their names, they left behind a legacy carved into the empire's very survival. For without the eunuchs, the harem would have collapsed under its own weight. They were the oil that kept the cruel machinery turning, the invisible hands that ensured 400 women lived in constant fear, constant obedience, constant intrigue. And they knew it. The harem was a cage, but the eunuchs were its wardens, and sometimes its masters. The eunuchs may have been the wardens of the harem, but they were not the only ones weaving webs. If the palace breathed perfume and incense, its true scent was poison. Conspiracies ran like invisible threads through the corridors, twisting together concubines, eunuchs, viziers, and even the valid sultan herself. For all its polished marble and glittering domes, Topkapi was less a palace than a hive, and its honey was ambition. Sweet to taste, deadly to swallow. Whispers were the currency of survival. A concubine who knew when to share the right rumour might climb, while one who let her secrets slip at the wrong time might vanish before dawn. And, because no one inside the harem could wield a blade or raise an army, poison became the weapon of choice. It required no strength, no confrontation, only subtlety. A few grains of powder in a sherbet, a tincture mixed into rosewater, a smear hidden in coal, and a rival could wither in days. European ambassadors who visited Istanbul wrote with a mixture of horror and fascination about this invisible war. They claimed that favourites were forever suspicious of food, that eunuchs tested dishes before presenting them, that concubines eyed cups of coffee as though they were grenades. Whether the tales were embellished or not, the paranoia was real. A sweet drink could be the last taste on a woman's lips. The conspiracies didn't end with food. Letters forged in careful handwriting were slipped under doors, accusing rivals of treason or infidelity. A concubine might wake one morning to find herself accused of looking too long at a guard, or whispering with a eunuch, or plotting with viziers. All deadly crimes, whether true or false. Proof was never required. Suspicion was enough. The Sultan didn't need evidence. He needed only the seed of doubt, and once planted, that seed blossomed into a silken cord. Concubines became masters of the double game. They smiled at each other, braided each other's hair, sang songs in harmony, while secretly reporting menstrual cycles to eunuchs or planting rumours to undermine one another. Trust was the most dangerous luxury. To confide in a friend was to hand her the rope for your own strangulation. And yet women still formed alliances, fragile and fleeting. They joined forces to bring down a rival, then turned on each other the next day. The Valide Sultan herself often orchestrated these conspiracies. She understood that control required balance. Too much despair and the women might collapse into rebellion. Too much comfort and they might grow bold. So she calibrated the chaos, allowing whispers to spread, nurturing rivalries, occasionally feeding rumours herself. A woman who displeased her might suddenly find herself accused of plotting rebellion, not because she had, but because the Valide needed her gone. It was discipline disguised as intrigue. One of the most famous conspiracies unfolded during Roxolana's rise. Her rivalry with Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother, was not just a personal feud, but a political chess match. Roxolana planted seeds of suspicion about Mustafa, whispering that he harboured ambitions beyond filial duty. Letters forged in his name suggested he conspired with enemies. By the time Suleiman confronted his son, the evidence was circumstantial at best, but the whispers had done their work. Mustafa was executed in his father's tent, his death the result of a conspiracy as invisible as it was devastating. Poison wasn't limited to concubines either. Viziers, those powerful ministers who guided the empire, also fell prey to the harem's intrigues. A vizier too, close to a rival concubine, might find himself accused of treachery. A vizier too critical of the Valide might die suddenly of an illness that struck after a banquet. The harem's reach extended beyond its walls, shaping not only private lives but public policy. Eunuchs were central to these conspiracies. They carried messages, concealed poisons, manipulated records. Some acted as brokers, selling secrets to the highest bidder. Others became pawns, unaware they were delivering letters that would condemn the women who had written them. The line between servant and conspirator blurred, because in Topkapi, knowledge itself was dangerous. And yet conspiracies thrived because they offered the only form of power available. A concubine couldn't wield a sword, but she could wield suspicion. She couldn't march an army, but she could whisper a rumour that made the Sultan turn against his own son. Poison and gossip were weapons that fit into small hands. They required cunning, not muscle, and in the harem, cunning was survival. Imagine sitting in a chamber lit by oil lamps, the air heavy with rosewater. A tray of sherbet is brought to you. It sparkles in silver cups, chilled, sweet. But your hand trembles as you lift it, because you know a single sip could end you. You glance at your companions. Are their smiles genuine, or are they hiding anticipation of your collapse? You take the drink, swallow, and wait. Every heartbeat becomes a countdown, every breath a test. And when nothing happens, relief floods you, but only until the next cup is offered. The conspiracies reached beyond personal rivalries. They were also tools of empire. Concubines, through their alliances with eunuchs and viziers, influenced policies, wars, even treaties. A whispered word in the Sultan's ear could redirect armies. A forged letter could topple ministers. The harem was not separate from the state, it was its hidden heart, and that heart pulsed with intrigue. But conspiracies, like poisons, were unstable. They often backfired. A concubine who planted a rumour might find herself accused instead. A eunuch who accepted a bribe might later be executed for corruption. Even the Valide could not always escape suspicion. Kösem Sultan, after decades of power, was strangled in her own chambers by rivals who had grown tired of her dominance. Her death was as silent as though she had ordered, her body wrapped in the same silks she had once used as weapons. This was the ultimate lesson of conspiracies in the harem. No one was safe, not the novice concubine, not the favourite, not the Valid Sultan herself. Every whisper carried risk, every alliance carried betrayal. The palace thrived on instability, ensuring that no woman, no eunuch, no vizier grew too secure. Survival was never guaranteed, not even for those who seemed invincible, and so the harem's music and laughter continued, masking the constant hum of plots. Women danced, eunuchs bowed, the sultan feasted, but beneath the glitter, poison simmered in cups. Whispers curled in corridors and conspiracies spun their endless webs. In Topkapi Palace, beauty dazzled, power tempted, and death waited quietly, smiling from behind a curtain. For all its secrecy, the harem was never completely sealed. The outside world peered in through cracks, and what little it glimpsed sent ripples across Europe. Foreign ambassadors, merchants, and travellers became unwilling voyeurs of a world they could never fully enter. Their letters and diaries carried fragments of stories, sometimes true, sometimes twisted, often exaggerated, but always dripping with shock. To them, the harem was not just a palace within a palace. It was the empire's darkest mystery, a place of both fascination and horror. European envoys stationed in Istanbul were among the first to record what they saw. Their access was limited, of course. No outsider could stroll casually into the harem's chambers. But ambassadors had informants, eunuchs who could be bribed, servants willing to whisper, even women bold enough to pass secrets in exchange for promises. Through these leaks, fragments of life inside filtered out, transformed into reports that startled their readers back home. Venetian ambassadors wrote frequently about the harem, describing it as both magnificent and terrifying. One called it a prison gilded in gold, where beauty is chained and fear is law. Another compared the concubines to jewels kept in a locked box, polished daily but never free to shine beyond the confines of their setting. The blend of admiration and revulsion coloured every word. The stories of punishments fascinated outsiders most. Tales of women sewn into sacks with cats and drowned in the Bosphorus horrified readers in Paris and Venice. One French envoy claimed he could hear the cries of women carried on the night air, though whether he actually did or simply imagined it is impossible to know. English merchants spoke in hushed tones of mermaid graves in the strait, places where fishermen refused to cast nets. And yet, for all their disgust, European observers couldn't look away. Their letters often slipped into a kind of lurid curiosity. They described the silks, the jewels, the music, the gardens, painting the harem as both nightmare and dream. To readers back home, it became almost mythical, a place where unimaginable cruelty wore the mask of paradise. The Ottomans themselves understood this allure and sometimes encouraged it. By keeping the harem mysterious, they fed the West's obsession and maintained their image as exotic, powerful, and unknowable. Some ambassadors admitted their own hypocrisy. One Venetian confessed privately that he was horrified by the harem's executions, yet reminded himself that his own city burned women as witches. "We condemn them," he wrote, "but we are no less cruel." Still, the harem struck Europeans as uniquely chilling, because it cloaked violence in beauty. It wasn't the public spectacle of a burning stake, but the quiet suffocation of silk cords in a chamber lit by gold. That quietness made it worse. The intrigue of the harem even influenced diplomacy. Ambassadors sometimes tried to sway imperial policy by bribing eunuchs or attempting to win favour with powerful concubines. They knew that a word whispered in the Sultan's bedchamber could weigh more than speeches in his council hall. Roxolana herself famously corresponded with foreign rulers, including the King of Poland. European courts marvelled and fretted at the idea of a woman behind veils influencing the fate of armies. Travellers too carried back tales. Merchants passing through Istanbul wrote about glimpses of veiled women moving through palace gardens, escorted by eunuchs. They embellished these fragments into stories of passion and terror, feeding Europe's hunger for exoticism. Playwrights and poets borrowed from these accounts, turning the harem into a stage for fantasies. Some imagined it as a place of endless pleasure, filled with dancers and music. Others cast it as a dungeon of cruelty, where beauty was devoured by tyranny. What none of them saw clearly was the truth. The harem was both. It glittered and it suffocated. It enchanted and it destroyed. Its paradox was what made it so compelling to outsiders. They projected their own fears and desires onto it, painting it as either paradise or hell, depending on what made better gossip back home. This outsider gaze also revealed the empire's contradictions. Ambassadors marvelled at the Ottomans' architectural brilliance, their military discipline, their administrative efficiency. But when they spoke of the harem, they wrote of chaos, cruelty, and secrecy. To them, it seemed impossible that an empire so organised could hide such darkness at its heart. They often concluded wrongly that the harem's intrigues explained the empire's eventual decline. How can a state survive, one English observer asked, when its throne is rocked by the jealousies of women and the whispers of eunuchs? Of course, the reality was more complex. The harem did influence politics, but it was also an instrument of control, a way to manage succession and prevent rebellion. What looked like chaos to Europeans was, in its own twisted way, order. But perception mattered. The stories ambassadors carried home shaped how Europe viewed the Ottomans for centuries. The empire became, in Western imagination, both a fearsome power and a decadent monster, its strength undermined by its own excess. For the women inside, the foreign gaze meant little. Their lives were not softened by the knowledge that men in Paris or Venice wrote about their suffering. They still lived under the same silken cords, the same silver trays, the same endless fear. But sometimes, when whispers reached them that Europeans pitied them, perhaps they felt a moment's grim satisfaction. At least someone, somewhere, saw the cruelty for what it was. Imagine yourself again in those marble halls, oil lamps flickering, music drifting from distant chambers. Outside the palace walls, ships from Venice dock in the harbour, their captains whispering about the mysterious harem. Across Europe, nobles gossip over dinners about women drowned in sacks, about princes strangled, about a queen mother who rules from behind veils. Your life, so narrow and suffocating, has become someone else's fascination, a story to be told in courts and coffeehouses far away. And yet, no matter how much outsiders imagined, they never truly knew. The real harem remained hidden, its secrets kept by walls of stone, by eunuchs' loyalty, by women's silence. The world could only guess, only weave myths from fragments. And maybe that was part of the empire's design. For as long as the harem remained unknowable, it remained powerful, a symbol both feared and desired, a mystery that made the Ottomans seem larger than life. Foreign ambassadors saw shadows and wrote of monsters. The women inside lived the reality, where monsters were not shadows at all, but men with crowns and cords, women with whispers, and eunuchs with keys. By now you've glimpsed the cruelty of punishments, the manipulations of eunuchs, the whispers of conspiracy, and the strange fascination of foreigners. But what about the quiet hours, the rhythm of ordinary days behind those gilded gates? For 400 women, most of whom would never rise to power or meet a violent end, daily life in the harem was a constant balancing act, a blend of beauty and terror, of routine and dread, of laughter that hid fear. If you walked the marble corridors not as a favourite or a valide, but as one of the countless concubines whose names never reached history's page, this is what you would have lived. The day began at dawn. The sound of the azan, the call to prayer, drifted through latticed windows, carried by the breeze from minarets outside the palace. Eunuchs moved silently through corridors, rapping on doors, urging the women awake. Concubines washed quickly in basins of cool water, their movements watched carefully. Then came the morning prayers, recited in unison, the soft murmur of voices rising like smoke. Even faith here felt less like devotion, and more like obligation, another part of the strict order that shaped each day. Breakfast followed, but it was no feast. Trays of bread, cheese, olives, and dates were distributed. Favourites might receive sweeter dishes, sherbets flavoured with rosewater or honey. For the rest, meals were plain, carefully measured. Concubines ate seated on cushions, glancing nervously at eunuchs who lingered to ensure order. Silence often hung over these meals. Laughter was rare because laughter drew attention, and attention was dangerous. After breakfast, training began. For novices, this meant long hours of instruction. They learned Turkish if they didn't already speak it, memorized prayers, studied embroidery, practiced music and dance. Tutors drilled them in etiquette, how to bow correctly, how to serve sherbet without spilling a drop, how to walk with measured grace. A misstep in these lessons could mean punishment, humiliation, or exile to the old palace. Imagine practicing the same song hundreds of times, your hands bleeding from the strings of the oud, your voice hoarse from repetition, all under the cold eyes of tutors who saw you as replaceable. For concubines already trained, the hours were filled with work. Some embroidered gowns destined for favourites, stitching gold threads into silk. Others polished jewels, tended gardens, or prepared perfumes. The palace prided itself on luxury, but that luxury was built on the labour of women whose names would never be known. Every jewel that glittered, every robe that shimmered, every room that smelled of roses had passed through the weary hands of women who would never wear, own, or enjoy them. Midday brought a lull. Concubines gathered in courtyards or chambers, sitting in small groups. Here, whispers flourished. They gossiped about who had been chosen the night before, who had caught the Sultan's eye, who seemed favoured by the Valid. They speculated endlessly, because speculation was survival. Knowing even a fraction of what happened beyond their chamber doors could mean the difference between life and death. A misplaced rumour could destroy a rival. A useful one could be traded to a eunuch for favour. And yet, amid the whispers, there was also humanity. Girls braided each other's hair, sang songs from their homelands, told stories of villages they would never see again. In these quiet hours, the harem felt less like a prison and more like a strange, fragile community. They laughed, cautiously, softly, and for a moment fear receded, but always it lingered in the background, like smoke you couldn't clear from the air. Afternoons brought duties again. Favourites might be summoned to the baths, their bodies scrubbed and perfumed, their hair oiled and styled. Novices might serve them, learning through observation what perfection looked like. These baths were luxurious, steaming pools, marble basins, gilded fountains, but they were also inspections. Eunuchs and attendants watched carefully. A blemish, a scar, even a slight imperfection could doom a concubine's chances of rising. Beauty was currency, and it was taxed mercilessly. Evening was the most tense part of the day. As the sun set over Istanbul and the call to prayer echoed again, the harem shifted into quiet dread. Tonight, whose name would be drawn? The silver tray would make its way down the corridors, eunuchs carrying slips of parchment with women's names. The shuffle of their footsteps made hearts race. If they passed your door, you breathed again. If they entered, your life changed. For those chosen, preparation was a flurry of activity. Baths, perfumes, silks, jewels. For those not chosen, relief mingled with despair. Relief at surviving another night, despair at knowing invisibility could mean exile. The unchosen prayed for balance, to be overlooked, but not forgotten, to live in the thin margin between notice and neglect. Night fell, and the palace glowed with lamplight. Music sometimes floated from distant chambers, oud strings plucked softly, voices raised in melancholic song. But the women listening knew that behind those closed doors destinies were being decided. A favourite might emerge in the morning with jewels and power, or her bed might be empty, her body consigned to the Bosphorus. No one could know, and for the women not chosen, sleep was rarely peaceful. Dreams were haunted by silken cords, by black-painted boats slipping across dark waters, by the faces of rivals watching with cold satisfaction. Even in slumber, the fear remained. This was daily life in the harem, a rhythm of beauty and terror, of routine and unpredictability. To outsiders, it looked like paradise. Silks, jewels, music, baths. To those inside, it was survival disguised as luxury. Every day brought small pleasures, a song, a story, a friend's laughter, but every day also carried the weight of possible erasure. The paradox was the cruelty. The harem wrapped women in beauty while stripping them of freedom. It gave them music while silencing their voices, perfumes while suffocating their souls. It promised luxury while delivering fear, and yet, through it all, the women endured. They endured through whispers, through laughter, through songs that carried memories of home. They endured through small acts of defiance, a shared smile, a hidden joke, a secret prayer. They endured because to endure was the only weapon left to them. The palace glittered on the outside, and Europe marvelled. But inside, the concubines lived each day as a delicate dance across a tightrope stretched over an abyss. Every sunrise was a reprieve, every sunset a threat. Their lives were measured not in years, but in chances, in whispers, in sips of sherbet that might or might not be poisoned. And so daily life in the harem continued. Beautiful and terrifying, ordinary and extraordinary. A world where silence was survival, where routine masked cruelty, where even the most fragile laugh was an act of rebellion against the walls that sought to erase them. By the 17th century, the Ottoman harem was no longer the glittering, terrifying machine it had once been. The rituals remained, the eunuchs still marched with silent sandals, the silver tray still rattled down marble corridors, but the system itself began to show cracks. The empire that had once expanded with relentless energy now strained under its own weight, and the harem, once a symbol of its order and power, became a mirror reflecting its decline. The causes were everywhere, woven into the daily life of the palace. Sultans no longer led armies into battle as their ancestors had. Earlier rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent had commanded campaigns personally, earning both loyalty and fear from their soldiers. Later sultans often remained cloistered in Topkapi, insulated by luxury, distracted by the harem's intrigues. Princes who once honed their skills as governors in provinces were now locked in the golden cage, emerging as grown men with no experience of war, politics, or leadership. A ruler raised in confinement was unlikely to command an empire with confidence. This shift had ripple effects. Viziers and bureaucrats began to take more control, while powerful women like Kosum Sultan and Turan Sultan filled the vacuum left by weak or absent rulers. The so-called Sultanate of Women wasn't a myth, it was a symptom of decline. When child sultans or unstable heirs sat on the throne, the Valid Sultan stepped in as regent, guiding policies, commanding alliances, even directing wars. For decades, women in the harem ruled more effectively than the men they had birthed. Admirable in its own way, perhaps, but to foreign eyes it was proof that the Ottoman system was faltering. The harem itself began to change. Numbers swelled far beyond earlier centuries. Where once a few hundred concubines sufficed, now thousands were kept, draining the treasury. Feeding, clothing, and training them consumed resources that might once have gone to armies or infrastructure. The harem became less a selective institution and more a bloated court, filled with women who had little chance of ever meeting the sultan. Many languished in obscurity, their lives reduced to endless waiting. With numbers came inefficiency. Eunuchs multiplied, bureaucracy thickened, records grew inconsistent. Where once every death had been meticulously recorded, now omissions crept in. Rumours of corruption swirled, eunuchs accepting bribes to promote favourites, concubines buying positions, viziers manipulating selections to their advantage. The delicate machinery that had once balanced hope and despair began to creak under the strain of greed. Even the rituals lost their sharpness. The silver tray, once a symbol of terror, became a formality. Sultans grew less interested in nightly lotteries, preferring a smaller circle of trusted favourites. The rest of the women became little more than prisoners, ornamented and idle. For them, invisibility stretched not over days but over lifetimes. Some spent decades in chambers without ever being summoned, growing old in silence, their beauty wasted, their names forgotten before they died. The decline of discipline made the harem more dangerous. Rivalries once contained by fear now spilled into open conspiracies. Poisonings grew more frequent, alliances more unstable. Kosum Sultan's assassination in 1651 was the most shocking sign. After decades of power, she was strangled in her own chambers by order of her daughter-in-law Turhan Sultan, who sought to secure power for her own son. The murder of a Valide Sultan by another woman of the harem was unthinkable in earlier centuries. By then, it was a symptom of a system devouring itself. Outside the palace, the empire's enemies grew bolder. European powers that once cowered before the Ottomans now pressed against their borders. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the turning of the tide. Military defeats piled up, and European observers increasingly blamed the harem. They claimed that weak sultans, distracted by silks and perfumes, had abandoned the empire's strength. In pamphlets and plays, Europeans caricatured the Ottomans as effeminate despots, smothered by women and eunuchs. These portrayals were propaganda, exaggerated and cruel, but they reflected a real sense that the harem had become less an engine of order and more a symbol of decline. Inside Topkapi, the atmosphere shifted. Fear remained, but it was dulled by apathy. Concubines still whispered, still schemed, still feared the silken cord. But the machinery that once turned with ruthless efficiency now sputtered. Some women endured in quiet resignation, their ambitions extinguished. Others clung to the old ways, still plotting, still poisoning, but their efforts often ended in futility. The system itself was too bloated, too fractured to reward cunning as it once had. The golden cage, too, became more absurd. Princes languished for decades in confinement, emerging broken men unfit to rule. Some sultans ruled for only a few years before madness or incompetence consumed them. The empire limped forward, held together by the strength of viziers like the Köprülü family, while the harem increasingly symbolized stagnation. And yet decline did not erase cruelty. Women still drowned in the Bosphorus, though less frequently. Concubines still vanished into the old palace, their lives erased by silence. Eunuchs still tightened silken cords around trembling throats. But these acts no longer served the cold efficiency of empire. They were no longer about maintaining order. They were simply habits, cruelties repeated because they had always been so. The harem became not a finely tuned machine but a haunted echo, carrying out rituals long after their purpose had withered. For the women inside, decline brought no relief. If anything, it brought new despair. At least in earlier centuries, ambition could sometimes carve a path to power. Roxolana had risen from slave to queen. Kursum had ruled an empire, but by the 18th century opportunities narrowed. The harem was too crowded, the sultan too distracted, the valide too embattled. Most concubines were condemned to wait endlessly in chambers that never opened, their youth wasted, their old age spent in obscurity. Foreign ambassadors noticed the change. Where once they wrote breathless accounts of cruelty and intrigue, now they described stagnation. They called the harem a rotting orchard, filled with women like fruit left to spoil. The old terrors still existed, but they were dulled, almost mechanical. To Europe, the harem became less terrifying and more pathetic, a symbol of an empire that had once terrified Christendom, now crumbling under its own weight, and yet, even in decline, the harem remained powerful in imagination. Poets still wrote of it, travellers still whispered of its mysteries, Europeans still painted it as both paradise and prison. The reality was more mundane, a decaying institution bloated with numbers, haunted by memories of a sharper, crueler past. Picture it. You walk through its corridors in the 18th century. The tiles still glitter, the gardens still bloom, the perfumes still linger. But the air feels heavy, tired. Women sit in chambers, embroidering endlessly, their laughter faint, their eyes dull. Eunuchs shuffle by, their steps slower, their authority weaker. The silver tray still moves at night, but fewer names are drawn. The Bosphorus still swallows sacks, but less often. The rituals continue, but they feel like shadows of themselves. This was the decline of the harem. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow fading, a long exhalation of a system that had once been terrifying in its precision. Its cruelty remained, but its power drained away. What was once a nightmare became, slowly, a ghost. The harem, even as it declined, left echoes that refused to fade. Trauma does not vanish when walls crumble, or when silken cords are finally set aside. It lingers in memory, in rumour, in the collective imagination of generations who lived under its shadow. Even when the Ottoman Empire itself staggered into its later centuries, the harem's ghost walked quietly through its corridors, whispering their presence in every shadowed corner. For the women who survived it, the trauma was carried in silence. A concubine who grew old in the harem, never chosen, never executed, might live out her years in the old palace. There, in dusty chambers, she would tell stories in hushed tones to younger women, stories of friends who vanished overnight, of laughter silenced by a eunuch's knock, of perfumes that smelled of roses and fear. These stories became lessons, warnings disguised as lullabies. To the outside world the harem glittered. To those inside its memory was carved into their bones. Even those who rose to power carried scars. Roxolana may have died beside Suleiman's tomb, but her rise was forged in paranoia, manipulation, and blood. Kosum Sultan may have ruled for decades, but she was ultimately strangled by the same silken cord she'd used against countless rivals. Their legacies were painted in grandeur, but beneath the grandeur lay pain. Power did not erase trauma. It only layered it with jewels. The echoes of the harem also reverberated through the empire itself. Sultans raised in the golden cage carried the psychological scars of confinement. Some emerged, paranoid, suspicious of everyone around them. Others emerged weak, accustomed only to luxury, unable to lead armies or rule decisively. Their personal traumas shaped policy, sometimes with disastrous results. Wars were lost, alliances broken, rebellions ignited, not solely because of politics, but because men raised in fear and isolation carried that fear into their reigns. For ordinary people in Istanbul, the harem was a mystery, but its reputation was unavoidable. Fishermen whispered about bodies in the Bosphorus, calling parts of the strait mermaid graveyards. Market women gossiped about concubines who poisoned rivals, their tales half-truth, half-imagination. Children dared each other to sneak near the palace walls, to glimpse the latticed windows behind which the empire's darkest secrets lived. Even if they could not see the harem, they felt its weight. It was part of the city's soul, glittering, horrifying, untouchable. Foreigners carried its echoes even further. European writers spun fantasies, exaggerating the cruelty, eroticizing the mystery. Pain became spectacle. The sack punishments and silken cords turned into lurid tales, stripped of nuance, repeated in coffeehouses and courts across the continent. In this way, the trauma of the women became entertainment for audiences who would never know the smell of Topkapi's incense or the silence of its punishments. The harem lived on not only in history but in imagination, distorted and magnified until it became something larger than life. But the deepest echoes were quieter. They lived in the songs and poems that concubines wrote in secret, scribbled on scraps of paper, whispered to each other in courtyards. Many of these fragments never survived, but a few did. Some poems speak of gardens and roses, their language coded, hiding grief behind imagery of beauty. Others lament lost families, villages burned, names forgotten, their voices struggling to be heard through the silence imposed on them. Even now, centuries later, they hum like faint music through the pages of history. The trauma of the harem also lived in patterns of survival. Women who endured learned to guard their hearts, to mask their feelings, to calculate every word. These behaviours were passed down, not only to their daughters if they had them, but to every novice they mentored. Fear became tradition, suspicion became custom. Long after the punishments became less frequent, the fear remained, like dust that lingers even when a room is abandoned. Picture an elderly concubine sitting in the old palace in the 18th century. Her hair is silver, her silks long since taken. Around her sit younger novices, still wide-eyed, still hopeful. She leans forward, her voice low, and tells them what she's seen. The silver tray rattling, the sacks in the night, the eunuch's footsteps in the corridor. She warns them not to trust, not to laugh too freely, not to hope too brightly. The young women listen, shivering, absorbing not only her words but the weight of her fear. In this way, the trauma of the harem passed from one generation to the next, even as the empire itself changed. Historians who study the Ottoman harem today sometimes argue over how much of the horror was exaggerated by outsiders. They debate numbers, question sources, analyse propaganda. But numbers and sources cannot erase the echoes of lived experience. Whether 3,000 women drowned or 300, the fear of drowning haunted every concubine who looked at the Bosphorus under moonlight. Whether every rumour of poison was true or not, the suspicion that poison might lurk in a cup of sherbet shaped every sip. Trauma is not measured only in statistics. It is measured in the way hearts race, hands tremble, voices lower. By that measure, the harem's trauma was incalculable. Even after the Ottoman Empire faded, the memory of the harem lingered in Istanbul. Tourists visiting Topkapi Palace today walk through tiled chambers where once concubines whispered, laugh in courtyards where once laughter was dangerous, marvel at jewelled baths where once water ran red with silent terror. They see beauty, but they do not feel the fear that saturated those stones. The palace walls cannot speak, but if they could, their echoes would be unbearable. The harem's trauma was personal, But it was also collective. It shaped the empire's politics, distorted the lives of sultans, scarred the women who endured it, and haunted the city that surrounded it. Even now, centuries later, its echoes remind us that beauty can be a mask for cruelty, and that survival can come at unimaginable cost. In the silence after the songs faded, after the perfumes burned away, after the eunuch's sandals stopped shuffling, one truth remained. The harem was never just a place. It was a wound carved into the soul of an empire, and its echoes would never fully die. The echoes of the harem linger, but now the story itself must begin to soften, like a lamp dimming after hours of burning. You have walked with me through marble corridors where laughter could turn to silence in a heartbeat. You've seen silver trays shake in trembling hands, silken cords looped 7 times, and black-painted boats slide quietly into the Bosphorus. You've felt the paranoia of poison, the conspiracies of eunuchs, the iron hand of the Valid Sultan, and the suffocating weight of daily life where beauty was both shield and trap. And now, as the empire itself drifts into twilight, we can slow our steps, draw the curtains, and sit in the fading glow of history's strangest chamber. By the 19th century, the harem was more memory than monster. The Ottoman Empire itself was crumbling, its territories shrinking, its armies retreating, its palace rituals looking less like power and more like performance. The Tanzimat reforms and the pressures of European diplomacy pushed the empire toward modernization. The harem, once a hidden engine of politics and cruelty, became instead an anachronism. No longer did hundreds of women wait trembling for silver trays. No longer did princes grow up strangled or imprisoned in gilded cages. The empire had changed, and the harem, so central for centuries, began to fade like smoke in the wind. Yet the trauma it left behind did not vanish. Women who had endured it carried their silence into old age. Eunuchs who had enforced it left behind estates built on whispers and blood. And the empire itself staggered forward, carrying the psychological scars of rulers raised in cages, mothers hardened by rivalries, and politics warped by poison and rumour. Even as the harem declined, its legacy shaped the empire's final chapters. Foreigners still marvelled at its beauty. Travellers visiting Istanbul in the late Ottoman years described the tiled chambers, the carved fountains, the latticed windows. They saw jewels and silks, baths and courtyards. But what they did not see was the fear that once saturated those stones. They marvelled at the architecture, but they did not feel the silence that once followed the shuffle of eunuchs' sandals. They admired the gardens, but they did not sense the dread that once turned roses into symbols of loss. The harem had become an exhibit, stripped of its menace but never of its mystery. And so the echoes softened. What had once been screams in the night became whispers in history books. What had once been terror became rumour. What had once been cruelty became legend. The harem transformed from a living nightmare into a story, the very story you and I have been walking through together. Now imagine yourself once more inside Topkapi Palace, but not in its height of terror. Imagine it after the silks have faded, after the eunuchs have gone, after the concubines' laughter has long fallen silent. The chambers are empty, the fountains dry, the lamps unlit. Dust gathers on tiles that once gleamed under candlelight. The Bosphorus flows as it always has, but no sacks slide into its waters. The gardens still bloom, but no footsteps echo in their paths. What remains is silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of absence. You breathe deeply. The air no longer smells of incense and rosewater, but of dust and stone. There is no silver tray rattling in the hall, no eunuchs waiting at the door, no rivals whispering your name. Only quiet, only calm. The nightmare has passed, and what remains is memory. And here, in this silence, you can allow your own shoulders to relax. You're not in those corridors. You're not waiting for a cord, or a sack, or a rumour. You are here, safe, listening in your own quiet room, centuries removed from the fear that once suffocated so many lives. History has teeth, yes, but tonight its jaws cannot reach you. Tonight its shadows are only stories, and stories cannot strangle. So let the images fade now. Let the jewelled chambers blur, the silver trays vanish, the whispers dissolve. Let the Bosphorus, once filled with sacks, transform in your mind into a calm sea beneath moonlight, its waters shimmering gently, carrying nothing but starlight. Let the palace, once echoing with fear, stand empty and still, its stones cooling in the evening air. Let the women, once trapped, be imagined free, walking home through fields of wildflowers, laughing without fear, their voices rising without consequence. The harem is gone. The empire that built it is gone. And though history preserves its cruelty, you do not need to carry its weight. You can leave it here, behind these closed palace doors, with the shadows and the echoes. Breathe slower now. Let your chest rise and fall gently. Feel the heaviness in your body soften into the cushions beneath you. Your hands can unclench, your eyes can drift heavier. The story has run its course, and you are safe, wrapped not in silks of terror but in the calm of your own room. If you listen closely, the only whispers you'll hear now are the rustle of your sheets, the quiet of your own breathing, the soft hum of the night around you. No eunuchs are coming, no silver tray rattles, no cords are tightening. There is only peace. So close your eyes. Let the echoes of the harem become distant, fading into history where they belong. Let the women rest, let the palace rest, let yourself rest. You have walked through cruelty, through beauty, through whispers and silence, and now the journey ends not with terror, but with calm. Sleep gently, sleep safely, sleep free of cords and cages, of whispers and walls. Sleep knowing the harem is only a story now, and stories when told can finally lay their ghost to rest. Good night, dear listener. The palace fades, the echoes soften, and you drift away. Far from Topkapi, far from fear, into the quiet embrace of dreams.